Part 3. Unceasing Practice. Chapter 5. Practising the Presence. While a sense of the divine immanence can come upon one unawares, a more extended experience can, with perseverance, become a welcome and frequent companion. But how can we encourage this awareness to remain with us at all times, to become a continuous aspect of our being, not just a longed-for visitor? If we are spiritual beings, then constant contact with our spiritual essence is a natural birthright. But how to go about seeking a deeper and more constant spiritual experience? Are there practices that will help us discover our true spiritual potential? This is such a universal aspiration that over the centuries, many techniques have been devised. In fact, a deeper and more permanent experience of the divine almost invariably proceeds from the practice of contemplative exercises, specifically designed to control and still the mind, and to let in the light and love of God. All, however, are centered around the same basic theme, a process or method by which one's attention is withdrawn from the world, even from the body, and focused entirely within oneself. It is worthwhile, therefore, to consider a few of these specific practices. François de Sales writes that to be aware of the presence of God is the first step in the practice of mental prayer, and he suggests 4 ways of cultivating this awareness. The first is to remember his omnipresence. The first way is to realize more vividly the omnipresence of God. In other words, the fact that God is everywhere and in everything, that nowhere and in nothing in this world may he not be found. Just as the birds, wherever they fly, always encounter the air, so we, wherever we go or wherever we are, find God present. Everyone knows this, but few give it much thought. Blind men, when told that they are in the presence of a prince, behave with respect, even though they cannot see him. Yet for that very reason they easily forget his presence, and so more easily lose their respect and reverence. Our trouble is that though we know by our faith that God is present, we do not see him with our eyes, and so we often forget and behave as though he were not there. To know that God is present everywhere and never to think about it comes to the same thing as if we did not know at all. François de Sales, Devout Life. The second way is to understand that God is within the soul. De Sales continues, the second way of placing yourself in God's presence is to realize that he is not only present in the place where you are, but also in a very special way, in the depths of your soul, which he enlightens and sanctifies by his presence, since he is, as it were, the heart of your heart, the soul of your soul. François de Sales, Devout Life. The third way is to think of Jesus looking down from above, especially when in prayer, and the fourth is to think of Jesus as being very close in all our daily activities, in the same manner as we might think of a friend, and imagine doing things with them. Although these last 2 methods relate specifically to Christian belief, the essential aspects of both can be readily practiced by those of other faiths. Using any of these methods, de Sales counsels, remember God's presence as often as you can during the day, and before starting a period of formal prayer or contemplation. As a popular practice, remembrance of the divine presence owes much to The Practice of the Presence of God, a book comprised of letters from and reported conversations with Brother Lawrence, 1614 to 1691, a lay brother who served at a Carmelite monastery in Paris. Brother Lawrence made awareness of the presence of God his primary business in life. He recalls that when he first entered the religious life, he would occupy the set time for prayers with various devotional and religious thoughts, while during the remainder of the day he did his best to remain aware of the presence of God. Slowly, however, he substituted all forms of private prayer with the simple awareness of the presence of God, which continued whether he was at prayer or occupied with daily affairs. For the first years, I commonly employed myself during the time set apart for devotion with thoughts of death, judgment, hell, heaven, and my sins. Thus I continued for some years, applying my mind carefully the rest of the day, and even in the midst of my business, to the presence of God, whom I considered to be always with me, often to be in me. At length I came, little by little, to do the same thing during my set time of prayer, which caused in me great delight and consolation. Brother Lawrence, Practice of the Presence of God. It is, he says, a matter of habitually applied attention. I have ceased all forms of devotion and set prayers, but those to which my state obliges me, and I make it my business only to persevere in his holy presence, wherein I keep myself by a simple attention and a general fond regard for God, which I may call an actual presence of God, or, to speak better, a habitual, silent, and secret conversation of the soul with God, which often causes in me joys and raptures inwardly, and sometimes also outwardly, so great that I am forced to use means to moderate them and prevent their appearance to others. Brother Lawrence, Practice of the Presence of God. Lawrence studied many methods of prayer, but found that they only confused him. Therefore, he resorted to the simple practice of keeping his mind in the presence of God, bringing his mind back without troubling or disquieting himself whenever he realized that it had involuntarily wandered. Having found in many books different methods of going to God and various practices of the spiritual life, I thought this would serve rather to puzzle me than facilitate what I sought after, which was nothing but how to become wholly God's. This made me resolve to give my all for the all. So after having given myself wholly to God, to make all the atonement I could for my sins, I renounced, for the love of him, everything that was not he, and I began to live as if there was none but he and I in the world. Sometimes I considered myself before him as a poor criminal at the feet of his judge. At other times I beheld him in my heart as my Father, as my God. I worshipped him as often as I could, keeping my mind in his holy presence, and recalling it as often as I found that it had wandered from him. I found no small pain in this exercise, and yet I continued it, notwithstanding all the difficulties that occurred, without troubling or disquieting myself when my mind had involuntarily wandered. And I made this my business, as much throughout the day as at the appointed times of prayer, for at all times, every hour, every minute, even at the height of my activities, I drove away from my mind everything that was capable of interrupting my thought of God. Brother Lawrence, Practice of the Presence of God. This practice, he continues, brought him great spiritual benefit. Such has been my common practice ever since I entered into religion, and though I have done it very imperfectly, yet I have reaped great advantages from it. These, I well know, are to be imputed to the mere mercy and goodness of God, because we can do nothing without him, and I still less than any. But when we are faithful to keeping ourselves in his holy presence, and setting him always before us, this not only hinders our offending him and doing anything that may displease him, at least willfully, but it also engenders in us a holy freedom, and, if I may so speak, a familiarity with God by which we may ask, and that successfully, the graces that we stand in need of. In time, by often repeating these acts, they become habitual, and the presence of God is rendered natural to us, as it were. Give him thanks, if you please, with me, for his great goodness towards me, which I can never sufficiently admire, for the many favors he has done to so miserable a sinner as I. May all things praise him. Brother Lawrence, Practice of the Presence of God. In short, according to the record of a fellow religious, his prayer was nothing else but a sense of the presence of God, his soul being at that time unaware of anything but divine love, and that when the appointed times of prayer were past, he found no difference, because he still continued with God, praising and blessing him with all his might, so that he passed his life in continual joy. Practice of the Presence of God. The practice required effort and perseverance. Whenever Brother Lawrence had completed some task, he would check with himself how well he had remained in the divine presence. He was honest with his failings, but did not disturb his mind over them, returning once again with renewed effort to his practice. When he had finished, he examined himself how he had discharged his duty. If he found well, he returned thanks to God. If otherwise, he asked pardon, and without being discouraged, he set his mind right again, and continued his exercise of the presence of God, as if he had never deviated from it. Thus, said he, by rising after my falls, and by frequently renewed acts of faith and love, I am come to a state wherein it would be as difficult for me not to think of God, as it was at first to accustom myself to it. As Brother Lawrence had found such an advantage in walking in the presence of God, it was natural for him to recommend it earnestly to others, but his example was a stronger inducement than any arguments he could propose. His very countenance was edifying, such a sweet and calm devotion appearing in it, as could not but affect the beholders. And it was observed that in the greatest hurry of business in the kitchen, he still preserved his recollection and heavenly mindedness. He was never hasty nor loitering, but did each thing in its season, with an even, uninterrupted composure and tranquillity of spirit. The time of business, said he, does not with me differ from the time of prayer, and in the noise and clutter of my kitchen, while several persons are at the same time calling for different things, I possess God in as great tranquillity as if I were upon my knees at the Blessed Sacrament. Practice of the Presence of God. Writing of himself in the third person, he repeats, You must know that his continual care has been, for more than 40 years past that he has spent in religion, to be always with God, and to do nothing, say nothing, and think nothing that may displease him, and this without any other view than purely for the love of him, and because he deserves infinitely more. He is now so accustomed to that divine presence that he receives from it continual succor upon all occasions. For about 30 years his soul has been filled with joys so continual, and sometimes so great, that he is forced to use means to moderate them, and to hinder their appearing outwardly. If sometimes he is somewhat absent from that divine presence, God presently makes himself felt in his soul, in order to recall him, something that generally happens when he is most engaged in his outward activities. And he answers with careful fidelity to these inward drawings, either by an elevation of his heart towards God, or by a meek and fond regard for him, or by such words as love forms upon these occasions, as for instance, My God, here I am all devoted to thee. Lord, make me according to thy heart. And then it seems to him, as in effect he feels it, that this God of love, satisfied with such few words, reposes again and rests in the depth and center of his soul. The experience of these things gives him such an assurance that God is always in the depth or bottom of his soul that it renders him incapable of doubting it upon any account whatever. Brother Lawrence, Practice of the Presence of God. In the beginning, he says, the mind will wander off continuously, both in prayer and at all other times. For this, he recommends only bringing the mind back time and again to an awareness of the divine presence. When the mind, for want of being sufficiently diminished by recollection at our first engaging in devotion, has contracted certain bad habits of wandering and dissipation, they are difficult to overcome, and commonly draw us, even against our wills, to the things of the earth. I believe one remedy for this is to confess our faults and to humble ourselves before God. I do not advise you to use a multiplicity of words in prayer, many words and long discourses being often the cause of wandering. Hold yourself in prayer before God. Like a dumb or paralytic beggar at a rich man's gate, let it be your business to keep your mind in the presence of the Lord. If it sometimes wander and withdraw itself from him, do not trouble yourself on that account. Trouble and disquiet serve rather to distract the mind than to recollect it. The will must bring it back in tranquility. If you persevere in this manner, God will have pity on you. One way to recollect the mind easily in the time of prayer, and preserve it more in tranquility, is not to let it wander too far at other times. You should keep it strictly in the presence of God, and being accustomed to think of him often, you will find it easy to keep your mind calm at the time of prayer, or at least to recall it from its wanderings. Brother Lawrence, Practice of the Presence of God. There is no experience, he writes, to compare with this continual conversation with God. Having made it his moment-by-moment experience, he would like everyone else to share in his joy and love. The practice, he says, brings with it a delightful spiritual sweetness. But he also counsels that this should not be the primary motivation, but rather to seek him for himself alone. There is not in the world a kind of life more sweet and delightful than that of a continual conversation with God. Only those can comprehend it who practice and experience it. Yet I do not advise you to do it from that motive. It is not pleasure which we ought to seek in this exercise, but let us do it from a principle of love, and because God would have us do so. Were I a preacher, I would preach the practice of the presence of God above all other things, and were I a director, I would advise all the world to do it. So necessary do I think it, and so easy too. Ah, if we but knew the need we have of the grace and assistance of God, we would never lose sight of him, no, not for a moment. Believe me, make immediately a holy and firm resolution never more willfully to forget him, and to spend the rest of your days in his sacred presence, deprived for the love of him, if he thinks fit, of all consolations. So go heartily about this work, and if you do it as you ought, be assured that you will soon find the effects of it. Brother Lawrence, Practice of the Presence of God. Indeed, Brother Lawrence cannot understand how those following a religious life can be satisfied with anything less than a sense of the divine presence. It causes no bodily fatigue, though it is advisable to forego pleasures that may distract the mind from its practice. He writes, I cannot imagine how religious persons can live satisfied without the practice of the presence of God. For my part, as much as I can, I keep myself secluded with Him in the depths of the center of my soul, and while I am with Him in this way, I fear nothing, but the least turning from Him is insupportable. This exercise does not fatigue the body much. It is, however, proper to deprive it sometimes, nay, often, of many little pleasures that are innocent and lawful. For God will not permit that a soul who desires to be devoted entirely to Him should take other pleasures than with Him, and that is more than reasonable. Brother Lawrence, Practice of the Presence of God. Thomas Kelly, who was drawn into a similar practice by his own experience of the divine presence, observes that the practice can be readily carried on throughout the day, whatever the tasks to hand may be. There should be no outward show, only a diligent, inward focus. Kelly writes, I should like to be mercilessly drastic in uncovering any sham pretense of being wholly devoted to the inner holy presence in singleness of love to God. But I must confess that it doesn't take time or complicate your program. One can have a very busy day, outwardly speaking, and yet be steadily in the holy presence. We do need a half hour or an hour of quiet reading and relaxation, but I find that one can carry the recreating silences within oneself, well nigh all the time. Our real problem in failing to center down is not a lack of time. It is, I fear, in too many of us, lack of joyful, enthusiastic delight in Him, lack of deep, deep drawing love directed toward Him at every hour of the day and night. Thomas Kelly, Testament of Devotion. The French Archbishop, François de Salignac de la Motte Fénelon, 1651–1715, a cousin of Madame Guyon, who actively defended her teaching concerning interior prayer, gives similar advice. Accustom yourself to make frequent, brief acts of God's presence throughout the day amid all your activities. Whenever you are conscious that anxiety or disturbance are springing up within, calm yourself in this way. Cut yourself off from all that is not God. Cut short useless thoughts and broodings. Avoid unprofitable talk. If you seek for God within your heart, you will find Him without fail, and with Him you will find peace and happiness. François Fénelon, Royal Way of the Cross. It is simply a matter of creating a joyful habit of always being aware of the divine. Writing in the 1960s, Nancy Mayorga, a writer who became a disciple of Swami Prabhavananda, himself a disciple of Sri Ramakrishna, was also surprised by experiences of the divine presence, and she, too, found the experience so compelling that the effort to maintain it became the primary focus of her life. The whole purpose of life, as I see it now, is to practice the presence of God at every conscious moment. I used to think that such a state of mind or soul would be conferred suddenly when I succeeded in reaching samadhi or union. Now I realize that it is a habit that has to be trained into me, and that samadhi is not to be the cause of this perpetual enjoyment, but the result and crowning achievement of it. By the time I have reached samadhi, I will have acquired the habit of the presence of God, and the moment of union will only set its seal upon the work accomplished. Nancy Mayorga, Hunger of the Soul.